Chapter 28. 20-year-old Alice Liddell flitted gracefully from one group of well-wishers to another, her long silk gown trailing on the ballroom's parquet floor, her black hair rippling down past her shoulders, her skin like smooth, unblemished ivory in the light of the crystal chandeliers. The most prominent members of British society were on hand for her engagement party: dukes, duchesses, knights, earls, counts, viscounts, and county squires. And all of them hid their faces behind masks, as did Alice. In the morning, newspapers would print detailed accounts of the masquerade for the benefit of the city's washerwomen, footmen, tavern keepers, cooks, and maidservants, the lower-class folk who struggled day after day to make ends meet and liked to gossip about a world in which they could hardly believe, a world of such rare privilege and comfort as Alice Liddell's had become. "Why, Mrs. Liddell," the Duchess of Devonshire stopped Alice on her tour across the ballroom. "Your dress is as stunning as one would expect of you, and your mask too, only what are you supposed to be, my dear?" Alice's mask was as featureless as could be: wax paper on a wire frame, with holes punched in it for eyes, nose, and mouth. "I'm every woman," Alice replied. "Neither ugly nor beautiful, neither rich nor poor. I could be any woman at all." Leopold approached for a dance. He wore a mask similar to Alice's in simplicity, although not as perplexing to guests. It was a mask of his own face, rendered in oils by a local artist. "My dear," he said, offering his hand. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the couple danced around the room, the guests leaning against the walls to watch. Along with the many pairs of eyes cast on them, there was yet another, a stranger watching through the window. Prince Leopold was not a good dancer, neither light on his feet nor easy with his turns. Alice was almost thankful. It somehow lessened her guilt for not loving him. Dancing was the only activity in which he appeared less than perfect. The waltz drew to a close, and the prince noticed the queen frowning in a corner of the room. "I think I'd better pay my compliments to my mother," he said, kissing Alice's hand. Leopold took off his mask and set it on a table. The stranger, who'd been watching through the window, entered the ballroom and, unnoticed, scooped up the mask. Alice had barely finished refreshing herself with a few sips of wine when she felt a tap on the shoulder. She turned and saw her intended husband wearing his mask, holding out his hand in request of another dance. "Already?" she said. "But what about the queen?" The man in the mask remained silent. The orchestra swelled into another tune, and he led her out onto the dance floor. With an arm around her waist and a hand at the small of her back, he moved her easily, this way and that, twirling her here, dipping her there. They were in perfect step with each other, as if they had been dancing together all their lives. The guests couldn't fail to notice. They cleared a space for the couple and applauded. Alice realized that whoever she was dancing with, it certainly wasn't her fiancé. "You're not Leopold," she laughed. "Alec, is that you?" she asked, naming the prince's friend. The stranger said nothing. Who is hiding behind that mask? Still, the stranger remained silent. Alice reached up and removed his mask, revealing the face of a handsome young man with almond-shaped eyes, a nose that had probably been broken more than once, and dusty, disheveled hair. "Do I know you?" "You knew me once," the stranger said. He turned his right cheek to her, showing the 4 parallel scars that shone pink and ragged against his pale skin. She stopped dancing, startled. But she felt a commotion among the guests behind her. Mrs. Liddell and Prince Leopold appeared at her side. She turned, but the stranger had vanished. "Who was that man?" Leopold demanded. "So rude, I'm sure he's nobody," Mrs. Liddell fretted. She'd never seen the prince so upset. "Tell him, Alice, tell him that man was nobody." I don't know," said Alice. "I don't know who he was. Please excuse me, I need some air." She hurried out to the balcony. It couldn't have been him. The man with the scars, it couldn't have. He didn't exist. Chapter 29. The cat swatted at a length of rope hanging from the ceiling of the invention hall. All around him, early prototypes of Red's numerous inventions were on display in spotlit alcoves. a seeker with the body of a tuttlebird and the head of a guermy, a dry, withered shrub that had been Natureside's first kill, a 2-card from the cut, half steel and half flesh, more vulnerable and not as mobile as the card soldiers that eventually made it to production, a preliminary model of the rose roller, a glass eye with one long horizontal crystal for vision intake instead of the more humanoid orbs in 2 sockets, even an early version of the cat himself with smaller claws and, as the cat himself liked to think, not as good looking as the completed assassin had turned out. He could play with the rope for hours, catching it on a claw, releasing it, snagging it again. He had begun to purr when Red's voice reverberated through the hall. "Cat, come to the observation dome at once." Usually, a summons from Red meant bearing a heap of verbal abuse, having his shortcomings shouted into his ear. But this time, Red had sounded different, almost pleasant, as if to surprise him with a treat. And it was about time. He deserved praise and spoils, since he was the one responsible for maintaining discipline among Wonderland's masses. The observation dome occupied the top level of the Mount Isolation Fortress, slick, polished stone flooring with walls of telescopic glass panels that provided a 360-degree view of Wonderland. The cat bounded into the dome with a meow, but quick as a tail flick, his mood darkened. The walrus butler and Jack of Diamonds were in the room. Why Red insisted on tolerating Jack of Diamonds, the cat would never understand. "I've been taking a stroll down memory lane," Red said. "And Cat, I'd like you to tell me again how you tore Alice's heart into little fleshy bits and hurled them into the pool of tears all those years ago." Something was wrong. The cat could smell it. Jack of Diamonds' grin was more self-satisfied than usual, and the walrus hadn't looked at him once since he'd stepped into the dome, too busy dusting the crystal sticks at the center of the long table, sprinkling dust on objects and surfaces as they needed. The walrus had been dusting the same crystal stick ever since the cat's entrance, a mound of dust rising on the table. "I followed the princess and Hattermatigan through the crystal continuum," the cat started. "I tracked them to a cliff." A volume of Inquindum Spiramus flew at him from the side of the room and conked him on the head. "So I tracked them through the woods to a cliff above the pool of—" The walrus's pouch of dust shot toward him. He saw it coming, moved at the last second, and it exploded on the glass panel behind him. "Above the pool of tears and Hatter—" A chair skidded toward him. He stepped out of its path. He tried to jump off the cliff into the water. Chunks of volcanic rock materialized and came hurtling toward him. He ducked out of the way of one rock, only to be hit by another coming from a different direction. "Ow!" I knocked Hatter back into the ground, and then I tore him and Alice into little fleshy bits and hurled them into the pool of tears. He fell to the floor, tired and hurt. Red came and stood over him. "You lie, Cat. You have allowed me to believe your lie for 13 years. I've been informed that Hattermatigan is in Wonderland, and Alice's heart is alive." The cat could see Jack of Diamonds behind her, pleasantly sipping liqueur from a clear goblet, his little finger raised in affectation. Of course, it's all right for you to lie," Red continued, "so long as you don't lie to me. It appears that if one is clever enough to figure it out, there is a way to return to Wonderland through the pool of tears." Her left hand formed into a cat's paw. She speared him through the stomach with the claws of her index and middle fingers. The cat gurgled and convulsed. Blood trickled from his mouth, and he died. The walrus did his best to ignore what was happening and nervously spread dust over the entire table with both flippers. Jack of Diamonds chuckled, but he stopped abruptly when his goblet leaped from his hand and spilled its contents onto the cat's face. The cat sputtered, coughed. His eyelids stuttered open. "Don't be so dramatic," Red told him. "You still have 6 lives left. Lie to me again and you'll have none. Now get up and wipe your chin." The cat stood, licked his paw, and rubbed it over his chin and whiskers, cleaning off his blood. "Here's what's going to happen," Red said. "You and a platoon of card assassins of my choosing will pass through the pool of tears. You will find my niece and will rip, chop, or twist off her head. I don't care which, so long as her head comes off. You will bring this head to me. If you return without it, I will assume that Alice is alive and you have failed, and that will be the end of you. If you don't return to Wonderland because you fear what I will do to you, rest assured that I will send others after you, and you will die 6 more deaths." The cat bowed. "I thank you for being merciful, your imperial viciousness. I will not fail you this time." "No, I don't suppose you will." Briefed on Alice's whereabouts by a smug Jack of Diamonds, the cat led his card assassins to the cliff overlooking the Pool of Tears. With no fanfare save for the wind and the mute trees and the beating of their illicit hearts, they jumped, succumbed to the extended downward tug of the portal, the upward velocity, and sprang from a puddle inside the Houses of Parliament. They flew up out of it and smashed through the windows, landing on the sidewalk in a shower of shattered glass. Chapter 30. Dressed in her wedding gown, Alice stood before a full-length mirror in the vestry of Westminster Abbey. In less than half an hour, she would be married to a prince, raised to the highest ranks of society's esteem, without giving her heart to a man she neither disliked nor loved. But her future seemed as uncertain as her past had once been. The room began to vibrate with the strains of the organ, but she hardly noticed. She reached out toward her mirror. Her fingers touched the cold, reflective surface, and she stood fingertip to fingertip with her mirrored image. What more had she expected? For her hand to pass into the mirror? Ridiculous. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Liddell bustled in, holding the skirts of her gown to prevent them from dragging on the floor, and Alice was glad to be rescued from her solitude. "It's time, dear. It's time. I can hardly believe it." "Nor I," Alice said, feigning breathless excitement. She kissed her mother on the cheek, and together they walked to the Abbey's atrium, where bridesmaids and groomsmen waited to make their entrance, along with Dean Liddell, who would escort his daughter down the aisle. "To think that the next time we speak, you'll be married to a prince," Mrs. Liddell sighed. "And you'll become a mother-in-law to one." "It tickles me to be reminded of it. You've made me terribly happy, Alice." With a last hug, Mrs. Liddell left to take her seat next to the rest of the family in the front of the Abbey. The wedding march began, and bridesmaids and groomsmen started down the aisle a pair at a time. Alice peeked out at the guests. Queen Victoria and her entourage occupied the first few pews on the right side of the church. A buffer of soldiers separated the queen from the rest of the guests, who completely filled the Abbey. In the rear of the church, newspaper reporters jotted notes. All were turned in their seats, waiting with anticipation for Alice to make her entrance. But she had wanted to take this opportunity to spy on her guests. Why? Because she was looking for somebody. One face in particular. She'd been wondering if he would show up today as mysteriously as he had at her engagement party. Wasn't that him standing in the shadows underneath the left balcony? She couldn't see his face clearly, but Dean Liddell held out his arm for her. She was being such a fool. Why torture herself over a stranger just because he had a few scars on his face? Lots of men probably had similar scars. It signified nothing. Likely, the man at the engagement party had just been a rival of Leopold's and wanted to show him up with his dancing. She took hold of her father's elbow. "Alice, my love," said the dean, "if it were anybody else marrying into such a public family, I should worry whether they were up to it. But not so with you. I suspect that not only will you continue to make Prince Leopold proud and hold his love fast, but that you will teach him more about acting as a force for good in the world than I, merely as a dean of his college, could have ever hoped to accomplish. He is lucky to have you." "Thank you, Father." With measured steps, father and daughter started down the aisle. Alice's face showed no sign of concern, no hint of the consternation that had been plaguing her since her masquerade. One might have assumed that all her thoughts were on the momentous occasion at hand, which was certainly what Prince Leopold believed. Dressed in full military uniform, ancestral sword at his hip, he stood before the high altar with the archbishop. Dean Liddell kissed Alice lightly on the cheek and deposited her at Leopold's side, then padded to his seat next to his wife. Leopold smiled at his bride. It was such a shy, odd, pleased, and overwhelmed smile that it fairly overwhelmed her. Alice feared he was making more of her than he ought. that not loving him wouldn't be the hardest part of their coming years together. It would be living up to his estimation of her. She turned to face the Archbishop. Behind her, pews creaked, throats cleared. The Archbishop began to speak, but Alice hardly heard a word he said. "If there is anyone here who objects to this union, let him speak now or forever hold his peace," the Archbishop intoned. Alice had a strong desire to glance toward the left balcony, to where she imagined the scarred man was standing, a man whose name she had with great effort tried to erase from her memory, and which she didn't dare to say to herself even now, as if to do so would be to conjure a figure whose non-existence meant everything to her present and future happiness in England. She heard herself repeating the Archbishop's word without comprehending their meaning. The vows. I've taken my vows. And now it's Leopold's turn. She stood listening to the alternating timbres and resonances of the men's voices. Then something strange happened. It was as if a gathering storm, moments from breaking, had sucked up all the oxygen from the enormous room, only to unleash itself with that much more vengeance. Alice would later swear that she had felt it coming beforehand, had felt something before the stained glass windows on both sides of the abbey exploded as the strangest looking creatures broke through them and landed amid the shards and crumbs of colored glass. Guests ran screaming toward the exits, trampling one another in their haste. Others fell to their knees and prayed to be delivered safely from harm. In the seconds between the shattering of glass and the first casualty, soldiers surrounded Queen Victoria and hustled her through a door normally reserved for the Archbishop, who hurried after her with breathless prayers. Prince Leopold put a protective arm around his fiancée, but she shrugged it off, unthinking, and now stood watching the cat-like beast fight his way toward her, swatting soldiers and policemen out of his way, raking their flesh with his claws. She recognized him as one suddenly remembers a dream hours after waking, and the recognition brought her a troubling relief, for this thing was real. She stood defenseless and unmoving amid the mayhem. These were not the card soldiers she remembered. Can't remember what isn't supposed to exist. Leopold and Halleck were battling four of the tall, steel-timed creatures whose backsides were protective shields engraved with card suits, clubs, spades, and diamonds. Both of the men had studied swordplay, but Alice could see that they'd be lucky to survive. Please let Leopold be all right. Whatever is to happen, may he... The cat took to the air, lunging toward her. Still, she didn't move. She extended her arm, reached out to feel once and for all if this beast was real, when... I knew it! The man with the scars came sprinting toward her from the periphery, pushing her out of the way just as the cat landed and smashed the altar with a downward swing of his thigh-sized arms. And she was running now, her hand in his, the man whose name she would still not voice to herself. He pulled her out through one of the broken stained glass windows and onto the street. The cat and card assassins jumped out of the abbey after them. The London street was a blur, a confusion of shouting, screaming people. A card assassin fell onto the train of Alice's gown, bringing her up short. With a single swipe of his sword, the scarred man cut the train from the gown, spun around, and severed the leather harness ties that held a rearing horse to its carriage. "Hey!" the carriage driver protested. But the scarred man was already astride the horse, pulling Alice up behind him even as he spurred the animal at a gallop through the streets. The cat chased after them on foot, his powerful legs making him as fast as any of Earth's four-legged creatures. The card assassins had come armed with glowing orb generators, and as the scarred man urged the horse this way and that, from the streets to sidewalks and back again, zigzagging to make a more difficult target, explosions shook the surrounding buildings. Dizzy with all of this action as she was, it seemed to Alice that her companion had a destination in mind, for if the horse skidded past a certain street, he would steer the animal back to it, and they would race along its course, past befuddled pedestrians and cursing carriage drivers. The man did know where he was going. He had memorized the route he had taken from his exit portal to Westminster Abbey and was traveling it in reverse. And they were getting close. A few streets still to go when an orb generator rocketed into an empty police wagon not 20 yards away, turning it into a fireball. Their horse reared, bucking them off its back, and they landed on a pile of cabbage in a street seller's cart. They jumped to the ground and ran, the scarred man pulling Alice, gripping her by the arm. "Where are we going?" she breathed. "You'll see." He pointed. A puddle. She was embarrassed by what she said next. The first thing that occurred to her as she and this man took a running jump into the puddle, their hands clasped. "I'll ruin my dress," she said, and then, shh. They were rushing down, deeper and deeper. She lost hold of the man's hand. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be. Yet it was. And as she torpedoed up toward the surface, having worked impossibly hard to convince herself that the place was about to be seen by her disbelieving eyes didn't exist, she said the man's name, Dodge Anders, and water filled her lungs.